thinking better and thinking together about life's most important issues. A place to finally meet in the middle, to think freely and reasonably about the big questions of life. This is Thinker Sensitive. Welcome to the 6th episode of our season on the question of God. Let's jump right in today. When a couple is shopping for a new home, they will typically approach the search with several lists in mind. A needs list, a wants list, a special amenities list, and maybe a pros and cons list as well. Lists like these will usually be supplemented with several different categories of comparison that contribute to the couple's principle of selection. Categories like dining room, kitchen, master bathroom, basement, and the backyard. Such lists and categories serve as the criteria by which the couple will evaluate their options. Sometimes the decision comes down to just two final homes. When this happens, the couple will naturally juxtapose these alternative options, comparing and contrasting the two homes on the basis of their previously established categories and criteria. The same method and strategy is used when evaluating ideologies and assessing life views. In the philosophy of religion, we call this worldview engagement. And it is to this task that we now turn. In the next 2 episodes, including this one, my focus will be on the role of the mind, or the role of the cognitive dimension in belief concerning God. In these episodes, I will introduce and present the standards and categories that I use to evaluate the question of God, juxtaposing or comparing and contrasting worldviews based on a set of criteria. I hope that these categories will be helpful to your own personal assessment of this question. Coherence is my main criterion for theistic and atheistic worldview engagement. Both external coherence, which worldview makes more sense of reality as we know it and experience it, and internal coherence, which worldview is more logically consistent throughout. Here are the main categories that I use to juxtapose atheism and theism in order to compare and contrast them for rational evaluation. The first is cosmology, which has to do with the origins of the universe. The second is the natural processes, development, and conditions of the universe, which has to do with the progression, order, fine-tuning, and intelligibility of the universe, and the laws of nature and physical constants that undergird the progression, order, fine-tuning, and intelligibility of the universe, which includes all of the physical and chemical developments that took place before the Earth existed, and all of the cellular and biological developments that took place after the Earth existed. The third is anthropology, which for the sake of time, I'm reducing to human rationality and human freedom. The fourth is morality and ethics. The fifth is the nature of truth. The sixth is the problem of evil, which has to do with pain and suffering. And the seventh is the problem of beauty. The layout of this evaluation will be as follows. I will give a terse propositional statement for each category, followed by some personal analysis and commentary. My personal assessment will revolve around the philosophical principle of causation, the concept of a miracle or the miraculous, and the notion of faith. These concepts will be paired with my main criterion of coherence or consistency. For example, here are the types of questions that I will be asking. On the basis of philosophical causation, is a theistic worldview more miraculous, or is an atheistic worldview more miraculous? Is the world as we know it and experience it more miraculous in a theistic worldview or in an atheistic worldview? Which worldview actually requires more faith from its adherents? Theism or atheism? Does it take more faith to believe that God exists or to believe that God doesn't exist? When it comes to these categories and criteria, which worldview is more consistent and coherent throughout? One additional note is required at this point. I will not be dealing with a bunch of counterarguments and possible loopholes in this section of the season. This is not because counterarguments and possible loopholes don't exist. They certainly do. And this is definitely not because I'm trying to sidestep them or avoid them. It's simply for the sake of scope and time. In terms of scope, I'm trying to narrow my focus to positive arguments for why I believe in God. In terms of time, I simply don't have the hours to deal with every counterargument or possible loophole during this season. So here's the deal. I'm going to respond to the two most popular counterarguments and loopholes up front, right now. I can do this because they are interdisciplinary, in the sense that they overlap with multiple categories and criteria. The most common counterargument to various arguments for God's existence is the God of the gaps accusation, which essentially says that just because there are things that science can't yet explain doesn't mean that a divine being is the only possible explanation for them. It may very well be that science will one day be able to explain what right now is unexplainable. This is a good counterargument in certain cases. History itself attests to this. But it's not always a good argument. Science may one day be able to explain the currently inexplicable. But it is just as likely, maybe even more so, that science won't ever be able to explain the currently inexplicable. Sometimes the God of the gaps counterarguments aren't really arguments at all. They simply punt to speculation and possibility. They attempt to demonstrate that no argument for the existence of God functions as an objective proof, which should really already be assumed. They try to skirt the responsibility of providing a thoughtful response on the basis of uncertainty and possibility, exploiting the nature of human finitude and fallibility. But almost all arguments are uncertain. We can play this same game with evolutionary theory, for example. And young Earth creationists do this very thing. Just because it is possible that certain aspects of evolutionary theory are incorrect doesn't mean that evolutionary theory doesn't provide a reasonable explanation for the progressive development of life on Earth. We don't just throw away evolutionary theory because of uncertainty. Young Earth creationists look for loopholes in evolutionary theory, just like atheists look for loopholes in arguments for God's existence. And the God of the gaps accusation is the most common of these loopholes. The second popular response to arguments for God's existence is the agnostic response, which is very similar to the God of the gaps accusation. The agnostic counterargument basically says this: well, we just don't know how this or that works, or how this or that happened, and it's not something that we'll ever know. So there's really no sense in trying to come up with a possible explanation. For an inquisitive mind like myself, this is a completely unsatisfying response. I've talked about this a bit in my critique of agnosticism in previous episodes. A lack of certainty or a lack of an unequivocal explanation should never prevent one from trying to find a reasonable or viable explanation. And it should never prevent one from pursuing truth and from making a decision. We too often punt to agnosticism. We use uncertainty as an excuse not to think. With that being said, let's finally delve into the first category of our evaluation: cosmology, or the origins of the universe. Here's our first terse propositional statement. Quote, something cannot come from nothing, end quote. We have an obvious problem with causation here. The effect, the universe, does not naturally flow from the cause, nothing. The Big Bang Theory is currently the leading explanation for how the universe began. It posits that the cosmos, time and space, had a beginning. But who or what caused this creative explosion? If I didn't believe in God, I would either have to believe that something came from nothing, which I think we can all agree would be a miracle, or that matter itself is eternal, which is what the Greeks believed, but which defies the Big Bang Theory, which says that the universe had a definitive beginning. Eternality is a theological or supernatural concept. If I believe that matter is eternal, then I am predicating a divine attribute to matter itself. I am treating matter as if it were supernatural. So, one who rejects the existence of God either believes in miracles, which is inconsistent with an atheistic worldview, or believes in the supernatural, which is also inconsistent with atheistic belief. The only other possible explanation or possible loophole is the concept of infinity, which is a highly debatable concept. But I'm not even sure infinity represents a real loophole here. Infinity is defined as, quote, that which is boundless, endless, or larger than any natural number, end quote. Infinity primarily describes something that has no end, not something that has no beginning. This is the key difference between infinity and eternality. Even if the universe is boundless or endless in the sense that we can't quantify how far it extends, or in the sense that we can't currently see how far it extends, the universe had a beginning and thus needs an eternal cause for its beginning. As both Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas would say, the universe needs an unmoved mover or an uncaused cause. Or, as some contemporary scientist theologians would say, the Big Bang needs a big banger. Let me cite some sources at this point. According to a 2021 article from swinburne.edu, which represents the top answer on Google, quote, the observable universe is finite in that it hasn't existed forever. It extends 46 billion light years in every direction from us. While our universe is 13.8 billion years old, the observable universe reaches further, since the universe is expanding. End quote. Furthermore, ResearchGate.net says, quote, according to the current cosmology, our universe is finite and unbounded, even if it is expanding. End quote. Finally, according to a 2022 article published at bigthink.com by Ethan Siegel, who has a PhD in astrophysics, quote, 13.8 billion years ago, what we know as our universe began with the hot Big Bang. The universe was filled with matter, antimatter, radiation, and existed in an ultra hot, ultra dense, but expanding and cooling state. By today, the volume containing our observable universe has expanded to about 46 billion light years in radius, with the light that's first arriving at our eyes today corresponding to the limit of what we can measure. Although that's a huge distance, it's not infinitely large. It's merely the limits of what we can observe. End quote. The article continues, quote, but as big as that is, it still isn't infinite. A lower bound of the universe being at least 18 trillion light years in all directions is tremendous, but it's still finite. End quote. In another place, the article states, quote, from our best observations, we know that the universe is an awful lot bigger than the part we can observe. Beyond what we can see, we strongly suspect that there's plenty more universe out there just like ours, with the same laws of physics, the same types of physical cosmic structures, and the same chances at complex life. But as inconceivably large as that entire universe, or multiverse if you prefer, may be, it might not be infinite. In fact, unless inflation went on for a truly infinite amount of time, or the universe was born infinitely large, the universe ought to be finite in extent. End quote. The article concludes with these words, quote, we only know how to access the information available inside our observable universe, those 46 billion light years in all directions. The answer to the biggest of all questions, of whether the universe is finite or infinite, might be encoded in the universe itself, but we can't access enough of it to know. Until we either figure it out or come up with a clever scheme to expand what we know physics is capable of, all we'll have are the possibilities. End quote. In accordance with these sources, I would say that the universe, should be finite. This coheres with human experience. In the world that we know and experience, on the earth that we know and experience, everything is finite. Everything has a limit, and everything has an end. Why would we think anything different of the expanding universe? Even if the universe is infinite, which again is highly debatable, it appears to have had a clear beginning, which coheres with Big Bang cosmology. This also coheres with the Judeo Christian understanding of creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, which to me makes far more sense in a theistic worldview. In conclusion, I personally believe that theism makes more sense of the origins of the universe than atheism does. I believe that theism is more consistent with contemporary cosmology. I believe that it takes more faith to believe that something came from nothing than to believe that something came from God. A being who is eternal by nature and thus has no beginning by nature. The second category of engagement, and the final category of engagement for this episode, is the natural processes, development, and conditions of the universe. Here is our terse propositional statement for this category. Quote, the laws, physical constants, progression, order, intelligibility, and creative novelty of the universe all imply rational and purposeful orchestration and design. End quote. Within a true atheistic framework, or a naturalistic interpretation of universal processes, matter is mindless, thoughtless, and volitionless. It is blind, unguided, purposeless, directionless, goalless. How can this understanding of matter, of chemicals, gases, acids, and atoms explain the novel and creative results of the universe? How can something unguided and undirected by mind or will have any semblance of direction or progression? How can something without a specific goal in mind, because it has no mind, lead to the complexity and order and lawfulness and upward mobility and apparent design that we see in the universe today? How did will-less, volitionless matter seemingly make all the perfect decisions or choices that had to be made in order for a life-sustaining planet like the Earth to be formed? Again, the universe is 13.8 billion years old. The Earth has only been around for 4.5 billion years. How many things in an extremely vast, almost infinite chain of events during that immensely long interval had to go right in order that carbon-based life could be a possibility? Let me give just one example of the miraculous, near impossible nature of the development of the world as we know it, of the formation of the Earth and the existence of cellular life forms, and specifically human beings. Owen Gingerich, professor of astronomy and the history of science at Harvard University, says this about the incredible balance between the outward energy of expansion and the gravitational forces in the Big Bang explosion. Quote, the initial balance had to be accurate to about 1 part in 10 to the 59th power, a ratio of 1 to 1 followed by 59 zeros, an unimaginably large number. End quote. There's a reason why Owen Gingrich believes in God. What's the likeliness of something like this transpiring by pure happenstance? If this isn't a miracle, then what is? This is just one example out of a vast magnitude of examples that demonstrate that the conditions for the existence and development of carbon based life were incredibly fine tuned. The universe was fine tuned for life. Everything had to be perfect. Everything had to go perfectly. And it did. Now, this is just in terms of the history of the universe before the formation of the earth. This is just in terms of the disciplines of physics, astronomy, and chemistry prior to the development of cellular life. This is not even to mention the history of the developmental processes on the earth itself. This is not even to mention the discipline of evolutionary biology. On Earth, how many things had to go just right in order for unicellular organisms to form? In order for multicellular organisms to form? How many near impossibilities? How many miracles had to happen? And how did these things happen before the formation of beings with centralized nervous systems, with a brain and spinal cord? In other words, once again, how did mindless, thoughtless, volitionless, willless, brainless, and spineless living things and cellular organisms seemingly make all the perfect selections in an immensely long line of selections in order for super complex things like the human brain, which is the most complex thing known to man, something that we still don't fully understand, to develop? Where does this creative and novel upward mobility and upward trajectory in the evolutionary process come from? It is as if unwilling and unknowing cells have the blueprint of creation imprinted on them. How is this possible? Who imprinted or imparted this blueprint? And how can brainless and willless things act upon such a blueprint and bring it about in seamless cooperation and in perfect harmony with other brainless and volitionless things? It is one thing for trained scientists with a clear goal in mind, rational and willful scientists who can create the perfect conditions in a controllable environment to painstakingly manipulate matter and cells in such a way as to create novel developments and results. It is a whole other thing for blind and dumb matter and for brainless and spineless cells to do this on their own. Even the most intelligent scientists in the world have struggled and have failed to do these things. How have the unintelligent succeeded where the intelligent have failed. I personally don't find Father Time to be a convincing counterargument here. Time provides just as much potentiality for destruction as it does for creation, and probably much more so in this specific case, since it only takes one small imperfection to sabotage creation, while it takes every minute detail going perfectly in just the right conditions in order to advance creation and move it forward. One who denies the existence of God places an incredible amount of faith in willless atomic matter and brainless cellular life. I believe unbelievers are indeed people of great faith, even people of blind faith in a blind and unintelligent universe. I think atheists are believers in miracles. And I think one can make a pretty strong case that atheists are quite religious, worshiping gases and chemicals and mindless cellular organisms as creators of the universe, bowing down to a non rational, impersonal, and aimless process. One that certainly appears to have a well defined aim, that certainly appears to be guided and directed by an intelligent mind and a resilient and selective will. Does the denial of such things truly represent human progress? Does the rejection of God really signify human advancement? Making idols out of inanimate objects and creation myths out of anthropomorphic organisms, as if atoms and cells were little human beings with minds and wills, as if matter and nature themselves were the gods of this universe. Atheism sort of makes unintelligent things, including an unintelligent process, out to be more intelligent than human beings. I mean, could the smartest person in the world have created, designed, casted the vision for, drawn up the blueprints for, and developed a world like this, working out every single minute detail in precise, painstaking, and exacting fashion, navigating every minuscule mathematical, astrophysical, chemical, and biological problem and process perfectly? It is one thing for a rational human being to be able to do this, though I'm not sure how plausible it would be. It is another thing for non rational things to be able to do this. Those who believe in God believe that God created the universe. That makes sense to me. That computes. That is coherent. Those who don't believe in God believe that the universe created the universe. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I believe that one of these systems of thought requires much more faith than the other. It makes far more sense to me to place faith in intelligence and rationality than to place faith in unintelligence and non rationality. For clarity's sake and for educational purposes, I'm going to give a quick summation of what has been established thus far. As far as cosmology goes, in theism, The effect, the Big Bang, or matter, or the universe, naturally flows from a necessary eternal cause, what we call God. This means that theism possesses internal coherence and logical consistency when it comes to the issue of cosmology. Atheism, on the other hand, does not. For the effect, the universe does not naturally flow from the cause, nothing. And the concept of eternality does not cohere with an atheistic worldview. The theistic understanding computes with what we know from universal shared human experience in the world, that an effect needs a cause. One might argue, well, doesn't God need a cause then? My reply would be that the very idea of God involves the notion that he requires no cause for his existence, that he is self existent. Temporal things, contingent things, need a cause. But God is not temporal and contingent, he is eternal. One might also argue that we never actually experience God in universal shared human experience. But I would reply that we always experience God as the cause of everything. Because human experience shows us that effects need causes, and that things that exist always have sources for their existence, theism also possesses external coherence when it comes to the issue of cosmology. Atheism, on the other hand, does not. For we don't encounter temporal things that come from nothing, and temporal things that don't have beginnings in human experience. And then, what is more miraculous? That something came from nothing, or that something came from something? What requires more faith? That the universe just came into existence on its own? Poof, it just appeared out of nowhere? Or that time and space are products of an eternal God? As far as the conditions and processes and development of the universe goes, in theism, the novel effects of the natural processes of the universe naturally flow from their cause. Natural laws, physical constants, order, intelligibility, progression, direction, creativity, the earth, life, and intelligence all naturally flow from a divine mind and will, a transcendent developer, director, and orchestrator, an eternal fine tuner. We call this fine tuner God. This means that theism possesses internal coherence and logical consistency when it comes to the issue of natural processes. Atheism, on the other hand, does not. For none of these novel effects flow naturally from the absence of mind and will, from the absence of real intelligence, from the absence of real volition, from the absence of a fine tuner. The theistic understanding computes with what we know from universal shared human experience in the world, that a given effect needs a sufficient cause. I'll go into this in more detail on the next episode. But in theism, the novel results of the natural processes of the universe all have a sufficient cause, such that laws come from a lawgiver, order comes from an orderer, direction comes from a director, Progress comes from a progressor. Creativity comes from a creator. Life comes from life. Intelligence comes from intelligence, and so on. Because we know from human experience that a given effect needs a sufficient cause, theism also possesses external coherence when it comes to the issue of natural processes. Atheism, on the other hand, doesn't appear to have a sufficient cause for such things. In atheism, what is the sufficient cause for natural laws and physical constants that undergird the universe? Where did these laws come from? Who made these laws? Don't law and order imply mind, intelligence, and rationality? In atheism, what is the sufficient cause, or the sufficient causes, for the design and intelligibility of the universe? What is the sufficient cause for the apparent fine-tuning of the universe? Doesn't fine-tuning imply a fine-tuner? And then, what's more miraculous? That law, order, intelligibility, progression, complexity, and incredible creativity and novelty came from the absence of mind and volition? Or that these things came from mind and volition? Which worldview requires more faith at this point? I believe that there is need for both a creator of the universe and a developer of the universe. The former alone results in deism. The latter alone results in pantheism and panentheism. The two together result in theism. This is why I'm a theist. This episode, and all episodes of Thinker Sensitive, are available on thinkersensitive.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and more. Subscribe on your favorite podcast app today to listen to more thought-provoking content from Thinker Sensitive.